All right, so today we're going to look at British reforms. So this is the Victorian age. This is kind of like the Industrial Revolution is well on its way. And first thing we're going to look at is the British, as a constitutional monarchy. So what is that? Well, that means there's a monarchy in place. So we have the Queen, right? But we also have a constitution, which has a parliament. And so this parliament system, there's two layers to it. So just like we have the House and the Senate, well, they had the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So the House of Commons was the elected members. So it makes it sound like, it's democratic in a way. But at the time when it first started, like 1815, only 5% of people could vote. So we had wealthy nobles and landowners and squires that could vote. So in a way, it's a representative, but of only 5% of the people. What if we only had people, millionaires vote? That's what it would kind of be like. And then we had the House of Lords. So they were hereditary, meaning, they were passed down this right to be a lord or, some sort of royalty or landowner. It also included some high-ranking clergy as well. And they could veto any bill passed by the House of Commons. So in a way, the House of Lords had a lot more power. There also, another reason it's not like really democracy is because there were social and economic issues as well. If you were Catholic or non-Anglican Protestant, you could not vote or serve. And then women and less wealthy could not vote. So, and I didn't even mention that, 5% of people, but also even if you were a wealthy landowner and you were a woman, you couldn't vote. So this was at 1815. So that's where we're at. So, so there was also more issues with that representation in Parliament. So some rural towns had few or no votes, but they still sent members to Parliament. So these are called the Rotten Boroughs, or I think I'm saying that, Rotten Boroughs. So that'd be like, a lot of people move to the city, work in factories. So someone, a lord might own large areas of agricultural areas, right, rural areas, but they didn't really have many people living in them anymore. So very few people live there. Sometimes not many or not at all, and they still sent representation. So you might be representing 20 people. And then there was huge industrial cities like Manchester that sent none. There's tens of or hundreds of thousands of people working there, and they didn't send representation. That just didn't seem right. And you kind of see that today in a way. We have very populous states that send two senators, and we have some states like Wyoming has very few people, and they still send two senators. So this is an extreme case, but some people see some correlation to even our Senate, for example. So these were issues. And there was the Reform Act of 1832 that tried to address some of these, not all of it. So we had the seats in the House of Commons were redistributed, so that way the Rotten Boroughs wasn't as big an issue. It gave representation to bigger cities and towns, and so it's representing populations better. And they enlarged the electorate, and it basically granted suffrage to more men. All right. If you were over 30 years old, for example, and then gave the middle class a greater voice in government. It wasn't just wealthy landowners. It could now be people in the middle class as well. There were a group of protesters. They were called the Chartists, and they called for greater representation. They wanted universal male suffrage. So suffrage is the right to vote, right? So they wanted all men, over the age of 21, for example, to have representation. They wanted annual elections for Parliament and salaries for members of Parliament. So like a middle class or a lower class person could be in Parliament. So it's important. It's kind of important to pay our politicians. Otherwise, you'd only get people that don't need a job that are already wealthy run, and that's an issue. If you want representative democracy, you need to be able to have anyone serve. And they also wanted secret ballot voting, which is important. And this is actually a picture, 1848. It's an early photo, but this is actually the Chartist. What do you want to say? The Great Meeting, they called it. So these people fought for this right, and they do get more reforms. One person we haven't mentioned, now she's always been in the background of so many of the last, how many chapters? I mean, 1837 to 1901. I mean, we had a lot of stuff going on, like the Opium Wars, for example, the Crimean War, and whatnot. So then this person we haven't really talked about, but it's the Queen Victoria. So she served for 64 years, which was the longest at the time ever, until the Queen Mother that we have now in England. She's actually like 67 or 68 years now. So the current Queen in England has actually served even longer. But at the time, like, this is crazy because she became Queen when she was like 18 years old. So she was largely a figurehead, but still set the tone for British life. Okay, so I know when I learned about Opium War, I'm like, man, that Queen, but it's like, she didn't necessarily have the power. They still had a parliament system and a prime minister, right? She embodied the values, though, so she kind of set the tone and like represented the culture and what it is to be British, and so her values were duty, thrift, honesty, hard work, and respectability. So, when I think of early British life, like that's kind of what I think about too. So she set this strict code of manners and morals. We don't have someone like that, in our country. We don't have like a one person like this is how people should be. It's much more diverse. And even there too. So middle class confidence grew, and Britain expanded its empire under her. Okay, that's what she's maybe a little bit more known for as well. Okay, so there you go. So there were, this is kind of a new era of British politics. So in the 1860s, the old political parties regrouped under new leadership. So you can actually, like the Conservative Party is very, very large, and so is the Liberal Party in England today. But we have the Tories became the Conservative Party, led by Benjamin Disraeli. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. And then the Whigs evolved to the Liberal Party, led by William Gladstone. So these are two parties. Differences, sure, but like they're not that far apart today, at least. So both groups push for male suffrage, and in 1911, the Liberal government passed measures to limit the power of the House of Lords, which is good because it seemed like that was kind of hereditary and they had more power. And in time, the House of Lords became largely a ceremonial body. Okay, and while the elected House of Commons would reign supreme, and that's the way it is today. All right. Which is, more like our democracy. We don't have a House of Lords in ours. There were social and economic reforms. So by like 1807, they were the first large European power to outlaw slavery. We didn't get rid of it until 1865. But in 1833, thanks to William Wilberforce, Parliament passed a law banning slavery in all British colonies as well. So first it was gone in England, but then it was also gone in all the colonies as well. But the British textiles manufacturer still imported cotton produced by U.S. slave states. So, you're kind of condoning it still, right? And, it's a really good question. Do we still practice, are there still practices and behaviors like this today? I mean, think of our own products we receive, the diamond mines in Africa, or even the electronic devices that we have. Like, some of those materials come from very, very poor conditions. I mean, we're talking like pre-industrial revolution conditions. So it makes you think, are we still practicing this today when you have child labor in some countries and horrible working conditions for certain raw materials? So yeah, it's very relatable today. I mean, some people feel like some of the products we receive in America come from basically slave labor, child labor. So some people, and it's kind of a push today, companies, Congress, and even just people, consumers, pay attention to this more and more. And so maybe we'll see, work conditions improve in other countries because of it. So with that, there are, reforms in the working class as well. So by the early 1900s, Parliament gradually passed a series of reforms designed to help the workers whose labor supported this new industrial society. So when the economy changes, so does, the way we learn in our culture as well. So Parliament passed laws to regulate conditions in factories and mines, and we actually learned about this in earlier chapters as well as part of the Industrial Revolution. Governments and leaders start to allow workers to organize and have unions. Workers won higher wages and shorter hours, but that wasn't necessarily government like mandated minimum wage. But because of unions, it would just there became more industry standards of what wages might be. Okay, which is good for to grow the middle class, which we benefit from today. There's also social reforms, public housing, free elementary education for all children. Even around here, my grandparents, my grandma went to up to sixth grade, and my grandpa went up to eighth grade. That was it. And that wasn't that long ago. That was here in Fowler and Palamo where they grew up. So, yeah, I know it's kind of funny to think like that, but and then there's just more protections for poor and disadvantaged. When you see a middle class grow, when you see unions and organizations like this, they usually end up benefiting the larger population. Okay. We also see reforms in the criminal justice system. You've probably heard of like Australia and New Zealand being penal colonies. Like, what is that, right? So, but to back up a second, punishment, being in jail the rest of your life is horrible. But back in the early 1800s, capital offenses, were these capital offenses. They were like petty crimes, small crimes that were considered a capital punishment, meaning you could be put to death for it. So there were over 200 crimes. It could be something smaller. And you could be put to death for it. When we think of capital crimes, we think of basically like very serious things like murder. Like we may put you to death because of murder. But back then it was a lot of other things. Like I said, up to 200 things. Here's a picture of people exercising, which basically you put a mask and you're chained and you walk in circles, right? And also executions were public, and they were, I don't want to say entertaining, but they draw big crowds. So again, early 1800s, Industrial Revolution, more people are educated, growing middle class. Another thing is social reform or criminal justice reform. So, yeah. And we also have, like we mentioned, you don't have to write all this down, please don't. Okay. Reformers pushed for a reduction in capital offenses. So the death penalty was now only for murder, treason, piracy, arson. Arson could potentially kill someone. So people that had petty crimes might be sent to a penal colony. So, if you think of Australia and New Zealand, you can think of Australians as being all a bunch of criminals. That's not true, but a lot of them, their great-grandfathers might be or something. So by 1868, Parliament ended public hangings, and additional reforms improved the conditions of prisons and outlawed imprisonment when someone owed a debt. Okay, there used to be debtor's prison. You couldn't pay your debt, well, you're going to prison for years. And that was reformed as well. So, all right. Another change was women. In Britain, as elsewhere, women struggled for the right to vote against strong opposition. We take it for granted now, but women for centuries could not vote. But the British were kind of in the forefront in this area. So there was suffragists led by Emmeline Pankhurst. She used aggressive tactics, violent protests. It was, I know we think of like protests and people getting aggressive and violent as being a new thing. It's not. It's even women back in the 1800s. They did hunger strikes, smashing windows, burning buildings. You even saw in the video a woman, throwing a hatchet to try to kill the prime minister and ended up hitting somebody else instead and injuring them. Queen Victoria, a lot of women, maybe more traditional or just want to be more conservative in that way, including the Queen Victoria, opposed suffrage altogether. But Parliament refused to grant women's right all the way until 1918. And at that point, then women, 30 plus, and they owned land. So if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote by then. But it was actually passed as kind of like during World War II was ending, and they wanted to give men who were coming back from the war the right to vote. I mean, you might be maimed, you should probably be able to vote. So they made it 21 and above for men, and they made it women 30 plus who own land. So it still wasn't even close to male suffrage at that point. It took another 10 years. So yeah, it wasn't until 1928 did younger women down to 21 were able to vote. All right. Ireland. All right, that's that little island here. So British there's control of Ireland in this area right here. It wasn't necessarily its own sovereign country at the time. They never accepted English rule as a different culture, a different religion. So they resented the English settlers, especially the absentee landlords, that they owned the land, but they were never there. They lived in poverty. They were Catholic. They had to pay tithes. Even though they were Catholic, they had to pay tithes to the Church of England, which is a Protestant religion. So like they were, they didn't like English rule. There was Irish nationalist campaign for freedom and justice. So the Parliament passed the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. Catholics could now vote and hold political office. And in 1845, this is a very defining point for the Irish. They could, there was the Great Hunger. It was the potato famine. So, so basically, at least, there were literally like just families dying. I mean, the average Irishman ate like 10, 14 pounds of potatoes every day, and there was famine. So the crop, I can't remember if it was a fungus, but like, basically most of the potato crop was ruined. It could never be harvested. And at least 1 million Irish died, and a quarter of the population either, died or immigrated immigrated to Britain or the U.S. So, and we see that today. That's when most Irish came over, was during this period that was kind of kicked off by the potato famine. And sadly, the British, they continued to ship healthy products, agricultural products out of the country, even though people were starving. So the Irish still struggled for years to achieve home rule or local self-government. It wasn't until Parliament waited until after World War I to put a Home Rule Act in place. So they didn't really have much control of their own country until after World War I. And Irish, they settled across America all over the place. So when you think of Irish settlement, you can also think maybe Catholic settlement as well, because pretty much all Irish at that time were Catholic. But you can even see Irish communities a little more, even here in Michigan as well. They came in, just your mode of entry a lot of times in your country kind of determined your social and economic status. Many of the people that came over, Irish that came over, were poor. And they definitely, it was during the Industrial Revolution, so they took those lower paying jobs, those agricultural jobs as well. But yeah, so that's about it. I am sorry, this was much longer than I expected it to be, but it's the way it is. Okay. All right. British reforms. See ya.